There are moments in life that aren't loud or violent, but are memorable enough to last a lifetime. A moment when someone with just a glance decides you're inferior to them. A moment when dignity is judged solely by appearance. Imagine you're sitting on a private jet on a snowy afternoon. Tired, exhausted, just want to be left alone. Then a man walks up, takes your seat, speaks to you as if you don't belong there. As if you're invisible. If that moment happened to you, what would you do? Would you stand up? Would you remain silent? Or would you choose to stay silent only for the entire plane to come to a halt on the runway a few minutes later? Because you made a decision nobody expected. Today's story is one such journey. A journey of misunderstanding, prejudice, and quiet resilience. And if you've ever been misjudged, this story is for you. Before we begin, if you think insightful and relatable stories like these deserve to be shared, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's begin. Heavy snow fell on the runways of O'Hare Airport, blanketing the pale yellow runway lights in a hazy white blanket. Chicago in winter is always so cold that you feel like your breath is freezing the moment you exhale. But inside the private terminal for business flights, the warmth from the heaters softened the air. The gentle rolling of suitcases, the aroma of hot coffee, and the sparse tapping of keyboards created a distinctive soundscape, soft, luxurious, and utterly private. A Gulfstream G700 was parked not far away. The green lights under the aircraft's belly shone on the snow like a thin layer of mist. The technical crew performed a final check before passengers boarded, while the reflective spoilers gently vibrated with each gust of cold wind. In a corner of the waiting room, Naomi Carter sat quietly, her hands clasped together for warmth. She wore a slightly worn black puffer jacket, soft jeans, and running shoes with frayed edges. Her curly hair was neatly tied back. To an outsider, she could easily be mistaken for a technician preparing to board a plane to provide some kind of support, or some logistics employee who had been given a ride. Few would guess that this unassuming black woman was the CEO of Aerospace, the largest aerospace technology corporation in Northern America. Naomi didn't care what people thought. Never had. But today, her face showed clear signs of exhaustion. Real exhaustion. The kind that had built up after 3 sleepless nights of finishing the final report for a Department of Defense project. All she wanted was to get on the plane, recline her seat, close her eyes, and let her body rest. A young employee approached, speaking softly. "Dr. Carter, the plane is ready. We can take you out at any time." Naomi smiled wearily. "Thank you, Emma. I only need a few minutes." She reached up and smoothed the straps of the gray canvas backpack beside her. It was an old backpack that looked completely out of place for a CEO of her stature. But inside it held the most important thing right now, a prototype of a next-generation aviation security system. Something Naomi had spent 3 years researching. She recoiled, taking a deep breath. The chill in her chest reminded her of her father's words. "Naomi, there are places in this world where you'll walk into, and people will look at you as if you don't belong. But that doesn't change the fact that you deserve to be there." My father passed away almost 10 years ago. But every time it snows, the memories come flooding back as clearly as if it were yesterday. Emma followed Naomi's gaze and asked, "Did today's trip put any pressure on you? I heard the meeting in Phoenix tomorrow is very important." Naomi shrugged. "It's important, yes. But even more important is maintaining our own strength. We can't lead an entire army if we ourselves can't stand firm." Emma chuckled softly. "That's why people like her. She speaks so naturally." Naomi didn't answer. She just stood up, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and said, "Let's go." They stepped outside. The cold wind lashed against their faces, but Naomi felt a sense of relief at leaving the hustle and bustle of the station. The runway gleamed with melted snow. The G700 stood there magnificent and silent, like a peaceful haven amidst the storm. She climbed the stairs. Each step made her feel the weariness in her body more acutely, yet, at the same time, a sense of familiarity. She had flown to hundreds of cities, met thousands of people, fought battles that few understood. And today, she just wants to be left in peace. Inside the cabin, soft, yellow light illuminated the light-colored walnut wood. The leather seats were large and soft. The space felt much warmer than outside. Naomi dropped her backpack beside her feet, sat down in seat 2A, and sighed in relief. She gently zipped up her coat and settled into the seat cushion. Just a few hours, she told herself. Then I'll be all right. If someone had told Naomi at that moment that this flight would change the very person sitting next to her, she probably wouldn't have believed it. She didn't know that in just a few minutes a man would bored look at her with a judgmental gaze and snatch the very seat she was sitting in. And just seconds after that action, the entire $75 million private jet will come to a halt in the middle of the runway, much to everyone's astonishment. But that's a story for the sequel. The cabin of the Gulfstream G700 remained warm and quiet, like a living room for weary souls. Naomi clasped her hands to her lap, her eyes gently closed, letting herself drift with the warmth emanating from the air conditioning. In that moment, the silence seemed to embrace her a gentleness she hadn't experienced all week. In the soft yellow light, Naomi quietly recalled a morning not so long ago when she jogged around Lake Michigan in the biting cold. Her dark blue running shoes worn down by years had soles so taut that Naomi could feel the ground more distinctly than usual. But she liked it that way. The feeling of her feet touching the ground always reminded her of where she came from. She recalled every step she took running down that misty road. Every breath, every gasp of air. Every passerby unaware that the unassuming black woman had created a piece of technology that was keeping millions safe. Naomi wasn't seeking validation, but living in this society she sometimes couldn't help but notice the stares of others. Those stares said, "This path isn't for you. Are you really going to be CEO? Are you sure you didn't walk into the wrong meeting room?" Those unspoken questions were like tiny needles, not enough to bring her down, but enough to remind her that the world is sometimes not ready for her. People like her, people who don't fit into the molds. People want to impose on them. Naomi learned to get through them, not with anger, but with perseverance. The engine outside hummed softly, signaling the crew's preparation for a cold, snowy takeoff. Naomi opened her eyes and looked out the window at the gray sky, which was casting down snowflakes like dust. She stretched her neck to relieve the stiffness. The exhaustion from 3 sleepless nights made her back feel heavy, but her mind was strangely clear, the feeling of someone accustomed to pressure. From the front of the cabin, a flight attendant named Mila approached, her voice gentle. "Miss Carter, would you like some hot tea or water? It's quite cold outside." Naomi smiled slightly. "Ginger tea, please." "Thanks, Mila." Mila nodded and left. Her swift movements reminded Naomi of her mother, who had been a nurse for nearly 30 years, always moving with lightning speed when a patient needed help. Naomi was familiar with the image of strong women who were often underestimated because of their simple appearance. They were the silent pillars of the world. She lightly touched the soft leather strap on her backpack. Inside was a prototype of the new aviation risk management system, Air Sentinel. 2 months earlier, when she presented the initial test to the Defense Council, a general had said in a stern voice, "Dr. Carter, this system could save thousands of lives. It's not just a technological breakthrough, it's a legacy." Naomi nodded but said nothing, not because she didn't feel proud, but because she knew that each step forward represented a mountain of difficulties that outsiders would never see. Mila returned with a steaming cup of hot tea. Naomi took it, cupping the cup in her hands as if to absorb all the warmth within. "This trip is very important to you, isn't it?" Mila asked cautiously. Naomi smiled softly, her eyes gazing vaguely out the window. "It's important, yes. But sometimes I wish I were just an ordinary person. I wouldn't always have to prove something." "You don't need to prove anything. Everyone knows you're the one who revolutionized the aviation industry." Naomi looked at Mila, her smile warm but slow. "If that's true, then that's good. But sometimes the truth isn't as important as how people see you." Mila was silent. That silence wasn't awkward. It was full of understanding. In that moment, Naomi let her mind drift back to old memories. She remembered a time when she was a young engineer at her old company, when she walked into a meeting room where everyone was waiting for Dr. Carter. They looked at her as if she had entered the wrong room until she stood up to present. She remembered the face of an older white colleague when he exclaimed, "Oh, you're Dr. Carter, no malice." Just a moment of shock stemming from an unconscious prejudice. But Naomi responded with a statement she would always remind herself of: "Yes, I am who I am, and I don't want you to think I look like anyone else." The room fell silent at that moment. The G700's engines hummed softly again, a reminder that the outside world was moving at all costs. Naomi glanced at her watch. There were still a few minutes before the other passengers boarded. From a distance, she heard the terminal doors open and footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. It was the familiar sound of busy people, those who lived by the hustle and bustle and always thought they were more important than others. Naomi didn't mind. In her world, true importance came from what one created, not from the volume of their shoes. She closed her eyes, letting her mind drift like a gentle stream. But at that very moment, she heard a man's voice coming from the cabin door. "Good heavens, this compartment is smaller than I imagined. Can someone clear out all this stuff for me?" His voice was louder than necessary, tinged with the smell of alcohol and the arrogance of someone accustomed to giving orders. Naomi didn't open her eyes immediately, but she knew the peaceful moment of this flight was about to end. A tall figure stepped into the cabin, bringing with him a strong scent of perfume and the loud ticking of an expensive metal clock. It was the moment Naomi, who only wanted a little rest after a long, tiring week, had to open her eyes, for her tranquility was about to be challenged. And that was the fateful moment that led to everything that followed. The sound of footsteps grew louder as the man moved deeper into the cabin. Naomi slowly opened her eyes, not out of curiosity, but because the newcomer's boisterous presence had torn her short nap apart like a thin sheet of paper. The man, nearly 6 feet tall and imposing, had slicked back hair that seemed unyielding in the face of the wind. His expensive wool coat was covered in tiny snowflakes that hadn't yet melted. On his right wrist, a large metal watch gleamed coldly in the cabin lights. He stepped inside, as if the plane were his personal property. "That's Ethan Weller." Ethan didn't look around to see if anyone was already seated. He didn't care. He just stared straight at Naomi, a gaze not of someone looking for a seat, but of someone identifying who's in the way. Naomi nodded slightly, a polite, reflexive gesture. A small gesture, but enough to trigger Ethan's domineering instincts. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice low but clearly irritated. There was no smile, not a shred of respect in it. Naomi replied in a low, soft voice like a whisper. "Yes." Ethan lifted the heavy, rigid suitcase into the overhead compartment, pulling so hard that the metal clattered against the wall, making Naomi jump slightly. He pointed to the seat she was sitting in. "That's my seat. You'll need to move." Naomi blinked once very slowly, not because she was immediately scared or offended, but because she wasn't sure she'd heard it correctly in a context where clearly no one had a fixed seat. "You?" said this chair. Naomi asked again, her voice neutral. "Yes. 2As. I always sit there. Priority passengers do." Ethan said that with the certainty of someone accustomed to priority boarding everywhere. But he didn't have his boarding pass. He didn't check the list. He didn't ask the flight attendant. He just looked at Naomi, a black woman wearing an old coat, and decided to himself that she couldn't possibly be the one sitting in the front seat. Naomi took a very soft breath. The engine outside continued its steady hum, the snow still falling, but the cabin seemed to shrink a little, as if the air itself sensed something was wrong. "I don't think these seats are fixed," Naomi said, her polite smile a thin veil concealing her true feelings. "We can sit anywhere according to the charter flight regulations." Ethan chuckled, a dry, unfriendly laugh like the popping of an empty bottle cap. "Sweetheart," he said, tilting his head condescendingly. "I fly this way often. This is my seat. You just need to move to the back." The atmosphere in the cabin froze. Naomi placed her hands on her knees, keeping her voice calm as if she were talking about the weather. "On what basis are you assuming that?" Ethan picked up the phone, typed a text message, and replied without looking at her. "Based on affordability and experience. And because I know you don't belong to the priority group." Naomi was silent for 2 seconds, not because she was wavering, but because she was listening to her own feelings, a weariness creeping in like a smoldering ember. She's faced those kinds of comments her whole life. Even after she became a PhD CEO and inventor, achievements don't prevent prejudice. Sometimes they even deepen it. "Why do you want to sit here?" Naomi asked. Ethan shrugged, pulling out the chair opposite him, as if he were certain she would return it. "I need space to work. Meeting with clients over the phone, preparing my pitch. And this is the best place. You understand, right?" Naomi twirled the ginger tea in her hand to calm herself. The heat from the cup spread across her skin, making her feel as if she were still clinging to reality. She wasn't angry, not hurt, just sorry for the way this man chose to see the world. Mila, coming from the front of the cabin, stepped forward and whispered, "Sir, the seats on this charter flight are open seating. First come, first served." Ethan raised his hand to stop Mila. "No explanation is needed. I know this flight better than anyone. I'll sit here." Then he turned to Naomi, lowering his voice as if giving an order. "Move." Naomi looked up at Ethan. Her eyes were deep and still, like a winter lake, unwavering yet reflecting everything. A moment of silence, as tense as a taut string. If anyone were watching, they would surely hold their breath. "You're speaking to me in a way that's not very appropriate," Naomi said, her voice not rising even half a tone. "I suggest you change your approach." Ethan laughed, even louder than before, loud enough for a few passengers behind him to look up to see what was happening. "Sweetheart, I'm just telling the truth. I have work to do. And you?" He scanned Naomi from head to toe, his gaze stopping at her worn-out running shoes. "Don't look like someone who should be sitting here." Naomi fell silent again. Not a silence of resignation, but the silence of someone who knew they were caught between two choices: confrontation or maintaining inner peace during a day that had gone too long. She remembered her mother's words: "Choose your own fight. Don't let anyone force you to fight where you don't want to." A sigh so soft no one could hear it. Naomi stood up, not a word of complaint, no reproachful glance. Just a light, gentle movement, as if she were getting up to get more tea. She bent down to pick up her backpack, slung it over her shoulder, and said, "Okay, you can sit here." Ethan grinned triumphantly like a child who had just won the nicer toy. He sat down in the chair Naomi had left, swinging his legs, as if the world had returned to its familiar order. But Naomi felt something different. As she walked down the aisle toward the back seat, each step was accompanied by a quiet whisper in her heart. "I didn't give in because I was weak. I gave in because I chose peace when I needed it most." But life rarely leaves those who choose to be patient in peace, especially when they possess a strength that others cannot see. Naomi sat down in a seat near the back. She placed her backpack beside her. Mila approached and whispered, "Miss Carter, you don't have to give way." Naomi smiled gently, her eyes still fixed on the window. "I know. But sometimes you don't need to prove something immediately." Mila bowed her head, sensing that tranquility, a kind of power that was quiet yet made others feel at ease. Naomi leaned her head back against the seat. She let out a soft sigh and closed her eyes. But just then, she heard Ethan's voice from the front. "Finally. Now I can actually work without distractions." One sentence was enough to cool the cabin down a bit. Naomi didn't open her eyes. She just smiled, very faintly, a smile that no one understood except herself. Because sometimes the silence of a strong person can be a harbinger of an approaching storm. The Gulfstream G700 cabin fell silent after Ethan Weller's final words. Naomi sat in the back row, her hands clasped together, the warmth from her ginger tea still lingering on her skin. The window beside her reflected the dim airport lights, and the wind outside seemed to brush against the aircraft, creating a soft, long, and chilling melody. In that moment, Naomi felt as if she were caught between two worlds: an outside world where the snow fell incessantly, and an inner world where thoughts thickened and twisted into circles that were both familiar and strange. "You don't have to give way." Mila's voice still echoed in Naomi's head. It wasn't a matter of giving way, but Naomi still chose to give way. And the moment she stood up from seat 2A, she realized she was entering a familiar internal dialogue. A dialogue she had experienced countless times in her life, whenever someone judged her based solely on her skin color, appearance, or background. "You don't have to speak up in every battle," her mother used to say when Naomi was a little girl who stood in the middle of the schoolyard, clutching her school bag, trying to endure the teasing of the other children. "But you have to know when to hold back, and when to use your voice." Naomi leaned her head back against the seat, letting the snow outside drift vaguely across the window pane. She wondered to herself, "Today, I chose to conserve my energy. But was I wrong?" A part of her felt a slight unease, a feeling difficult to name. It wasn't regret, not self-pity, just the weariness of someone who had spent their entire life proving they deserved to be in places that others took for granted. Ethan, sitting in front, whispered something into his phone, his voice angry and slightly arrogant. Some people just don't get it. Not everyone belongs up here. Those words reached Naomi's ears even though he didn't want her to hear them. Naomi closed her eyes, not to avoid listening, but to listen more clearly to herself. She remembered her days as a student at MIT, a young curly-haired black girl living in a small dorm room, working in the lab until midnight to pay for books. She remembered that autumn afternoon when she was first invited to present her research to a panel. One professor tilted his head, looked at her file, and then blurted out, "Oh, Carter, I thought the presenter today was someone else." It wasn't a malicious remark, but it was like a cold shower. Naomi simply pursed her lips, straightened her shoulders, and walked up to the podium. She said nothing in response. But her presentation that day, brief, sharp, and powerful, silenced the entire room for almost a minute after it ended. That teacher was the first to stand up and applaud. Naomi learned an important lesson that day. Sometimes, a reaction doesn't need to come from words. It can come from one's true value. But she also learned another profound lesson in her later years of work. Sometimes, her silence wasn't meant to prove anything, but rather to protect herself from pointless battles. Mila's footsteps echoed again as light as a cat's. She bent down beside Naomi and whispered, "Miss Carter, are you all right?" Naomi opened her eyes and smiled so gently that anyone could think nothing had happened. "I'm fine. Just a little sleepy." Mila looked at Naomi for a few seconds, as if trying to read her mind. "If you need me to do anything, just let me know." Naomi nodded. "Just fly safely." "That's enough." Mila left, but Naomi sat in silence for a few more seconds. A gentle silence. A silence of someone trying not to let their heart be burdened by things that aren't worth it. The plane began to move gently. The wheels rolled slowly, vibrating with the unevenness of the thin layer of snow on the runway. Naomi opened her eyes and took a deep breath. Despite the cold, the cabin had a warm scent of walnut wood mixed with the aroma of ginger tea which calmed her mind. But at that moment, Ethan's voice rang out from the front. "This seat is too warm. Can someone adjust the airflow? Why is the signal weak here? God, can this flight get any more disorganized?" Each sentence, each word was like a tiny thorn, constantly piercing the air. Naomi listened from afar but didn't turn around. In fact, she didn't need to look to know what kind of expression he was making, the familiar face of someone who always thinks the world owes them a little favor. She silently wondered. "I chose to remain silent. But when will this silence cease to be protection and become complicity, a question heavier than she could bear today?" But it remained there, like a small stone in her heart. The G700 turned onto the main taxiway. The cabin swayed slightly. The green light on the fastened seatbelt sign lit up. Naomi pulled her seatbelt back, on looking down at her canvas backpack, an old, worn-out backpack containing the most important thing to her right now. She placed her hand gently on the backpack. The familiar feel of the fabric helped her relax somewhat. Her father had once said, "Don't let anyone decide the value of what you carry. People see a bag. You know, it's the work of your life." Naomi nodded softly to herself. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. But inside the cabin, a small storm was brewing, a storm Ethan had inadvertently created, and Naomi was slowly facing it. She never imagined that in just a few moments, her choice of endurance would bring things to the brink of danger, and she would be the one to stand up no longer in the gentle way she had at the beginning. There are battles you don't want to fight, but there are battles that come to you, not to test you, but to remind you that you are stronger than you know. The Gulfstream G700 began to accelerate down the runway. The engine roared softly, steadily, and deeply, like the powerful breath of a metallic beast preparing to break free from the ground. Naomi felt a slight pressure build up in her back as the pilot increased the power. Normally, this moment would bring her a feeling of relief, a familiar sensation for someone who had flown hundreds of flights in her life. But this time her mind was too preoccupied to enjoy it. Ethan was still at the front, his loud, harsh voice echoing in bursts. Mila tried to be polite, but Naomi knew the young woman was under considerable stress. People like Ethan didn't just occupy seats, they occupied the air around them. The plane lifted off, tilted slightly to the right, then stabilized at its initial altitude. The beacon lights went out. The G700 began its nearly 4-hour flight toward the East Coast. Naomi opened her eyes and gently unbuckled her seatbelt. She didn't want to cause trouble. She didn't want to waste time. She just wanted to get some quiet sleep. But just as she was about to lean her head against the window, a loud thud echoed. Ethan stood up, and he's moving backwards. Naomi didn't look, but she could hear the footsteps heavy, steady, confident like those of someone entering a place where he believed he had complete control. Then Mila said in a low but firm voice, "So the plane has just taken off. Now is not the right time to travel." Ethan waved his hand. "I'm fine. I need something from the back. Don't make a fuss." Mila tried to stand in the way, "I understand, but Ethan cuts across." "I said I'm fine." Naomi opened her eyes just as he appeared before her. The cabin light reflected off Ethan's jacket, making his face look colder than usual. He looked at Naomi as if she were an obstacle, not a human being. "You're blocking the way with your backpack," Ethan said, his voice irritated. "I need to get something from the back compartment." Naomi looked at the small backpack, placed close to the seat, not blocking the way at all. She calmly said, "The overhead compartments are only for use when the plane is fully stable. Where are your belongings?" Ethan leaned his hands on the armrest of the chair next to her, bending down slightly, his voice full of authority. "I don't think you need to worry about that. Just move your foot so I can pass." This time, Naomi looked him straight in the eye. Not an angry look, not a defiant one, but a look as still as calm water, showing that she understood this wasn't about the backpack, not about the walkway, not about the chair. This is about how he treated her, and all the people he thought didn't belong. "There's nothing of yours in the back compartment," Naomi said. "I saw Mila hanging your jacket in the front locker." Ethan raised his eyebrows. A faint smile appeared on his lips. "So, you were watching me," Naomi calmly replied. "I only pay attention when people cause a disturbance." Ethan smirked. "Wow. Bold, aren't you?" His words, his tone of voice, his gaze, all were the perfect combination of a man accustomed to privilege, unaccustomed to being told no. He tilted his head, lowering his voice, so only she could hear. "You should be careful how you talk." Naomi didn't move, but something inside her stirred. Not fear, not anger, but a very clear feeling. The path of patience has reached its limit. She let out a very soft sigh. "Mr. Weller," Naomi said, her voice low and slow, "you are not allowed to cause any trouble on the plane. If you need anything, please speak directly to Mila." Ethan laughed loudly, a laugh filled with mockery that filled the air. "Who do you think you are to order me around?" The laughter echoed slightly in the cabin, causing a passenger in the middle to turn around. Naomi sat up straight, her eyes unwavering. "I'm not giving orders. I'm reminding you of the safety regulations." Ethan pointed his finger directly at her, his voice louder. "No, you think you can sit here looking whatever you look like and act like you run something?" Mila rushed forward and stood between the two of them. "Mr. Weller, please return to your seat immediately. Otherwise, I will have to report this to the captain." Ethan Quay saying, "Mila, you're taking her side. Seriously." Over me, Naomi watched him. Every movement, every expression. It was all too familiar. People like Ethan never think they're wrong. They just think someone dares to disobey them. And when they encounter someone who doesn't back down, they consider it an insult. Naomi inhaled slowly, deeply, as if calling back calmness to her very bones. "Mr. Weller," she said, "you're causing trouble for everyone. I suggest." But the sentence was interrupted by a loud crash. Ethan lightly kicked her backpack, the one containing the Air Sentinel prototype. The backpack slid a short distance before coming to a stop under the soft yellow light. The silence in the cabin became absolute. Naomi looked at the backpack. Her expression changed, not quickly, not startled, but enough to make Mila take a step back. Ethan crossed his arms, looking triumphant there. "Now it's not in my way." Naomi stood up. She said nothing for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was long enough for Ethan to flinch slightly, even though he tried to maintain his arrogant demeanor. Naomi was almost as tall as Ethan, but her composure made her seem much taller. She took a small, inconspicuous step, but it brought the distance between them closer. Naomi's voice was low and firm, like the sound of a silent drum. "You just touched my property." Ethan smirked. "Relax. It's just a bag." Naomi tilted her head, her deep eyes seemingly holding the entire winter outside. "No. This isn't just a bag. And your actions aren't just a joke." Mila stood in the middle, sensing the rising tension. A passenger in the middle of the cabin stood up. Hey, is everything okay back there? Ethan turned around. It's fine. Just dealing with someone who doesn't understand seating priority. Naomi replied softly, I understand things better than you think. That statement made Ethan frown, as if for a fleeting moment he sensed something he hadn't initially recognized. Something not hidden in his expensive coat, not within the authority he thought he possessed. But it was in the way Naomi looked at him. A look that wasn't hostile, but made him feel small. Ethan took a deep breath. You know what, I don't have time for this. Then, he turned around and walked towards the front of the cabin. But Naomi didn't take her eyes off him until he sat down. She said nothing, didn't ask for an apology, didn't call the captain. But in that moment, a decision had formed deep within her, clear, sharp, and irreversible. If Ethan crosses that line again, she won't stay silent. Not to win, not to get revenge, but because silence is sometimes the choice. But there are times when it becomes complicity in injustice. Naomi picked up her backpack and placed it back at her feet. Outside the window, the snow had stopped falling. The clouds parted, revealing a long streak of light like a road. One path Naomi knew the moment Ethan kicked the backpack. That was the moment everything changed. The Gulfstream G700's cabin was now stable at an altitude of over 3,000 feet. The sky outside gradually turned a deep blue, the fragmented gray clouds drifting in the wind like silken scarves. The early morning sunlight gently illuminated the aircraft, creating a long streak of light running from nose to tail, looking like a straight line dividing the sky. Naomi watched the scene, and a fleeting sense of peace touched her soul. But that peace only lingered beside her for a few seconds. Because from the front of the cabin, Ethan started again. Are you kidding me? This Wi-Fi speed is unacceptable. His voice shattered the otherwise silent atmosphere of the compartment. Naomi didn't turn around, but she sensed the discomfort of some of the passengers. Everyone had their own schedule, their own worries, but only Ethan turned small things into world-changing problems. Mila tried to keep her voice soft. Sir, the signal is stable, but the flight is passing through an area of interference. Ethan cuts across interference. Interference is the reason. How much do you think I'd pay to hear the reason? Naomi sighed softly. The tension in Ethan's voice this time was different. It wasn't just annoyance. There was a hint of impulsiveness, like someone who felt humiliated by their earlier conversation. He's looking for a place to vent his frustrations. Mila bowed her head and apologized. Yes, sir. I will try to adjust it. Ethan waved his hand. Just do your job. It was just a small remark. But to Naomi, it resonated like a knock on Mila's self-esteem, a person who always strives to do her best, no matter the position. Naomi felt a slight tremor run through her chest. When strong people were disrespected, she could endure it. But when good people were insulted, her heart reacted more strongly. She placed her hand on her backpack. The soft fabric calmed her down somewhat. Less than 2 minutes later, Ethan stood up this time without saying a word to Mila. He went straight to the back, where only Naomi was sitting. Naomi heard those footsteps, heavy, fast, impatient. She wasn't surprised. Part of her knew he would come. Ethan stopped in front of her seat, his shadow falling over Naomi like a dark patch blocking the light from the window. Miss, he said directly, without beating around the bush. What are you doing with your backpack? Naomi frowned slightly. I don't understand what you mean. Ethan pushed his chin toward the window. Since you got into the back seat, the Wi-Fi signal has been significantly weaker, and it's also been noisy. I'm not saying this is your fault. He paused, a smirk playing on his lips. But what a coincidence, isn't it? Naomi looked at him calmly. What are you implying? Ethan folded his arms, looking knowledgeable. She has some kind of equipment in her backpack. Is it homemade electronics? Things that jam signals. Naomi was silent for 3 seconds. Not because she was flustered, but because she was deciding how to respond to him without making things worse. Air Sentinel is in the backpack. It's a sensitive high-tech device, but it doesn't interfere with Wi-Fi at all. She said it simply. None of my equipment interfered with the aircraft systems. This system is FAA certified. Ethan let out a loud, mocking laugh. Oh, wow. Look at you, talking like a specialist. Naomi simply replied, I am indeed an expert. Her voice wasn't loud, but the certainty in each word made Ethan pause slightly. Just for a second, Then he retorted, "Yeah, right. A person sitting in the back seat clutching an old backpack and calling themselves an expert. I fly private jets every month. I know people like you." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "The kind of person like me." Ethan crossed his arms and made a loud clicking sound. "The kind of people who hitch a ride. The kind of people who think they understand technology, understand airplanes. The kind of people." Then he said it. A statement that was no longer accidental. A statement made intentionally. A statement Naomi had heard throughout her childhood, throughout her school years, throughout her journey to becoming a doctor, and throughout her life, during which she strived to prove him wrong. "You look like someone who doesn't belong on a jet like this." The cabin instantly grew cold, as if someone had turned off the heater. The wind outside continued to howl, but the air inside the cabin froze. Naomi sat up straighter. She wasn't angry. She wasn't trembling. Her expression didn't change. Her voice dropped just a beat, enough for Mila to turn around immediately from a distance. "Mr. Weller, you are saying something offensive." Ethan looked Naomi up and down, a hint of malice in his eyes. "She doesn't belong here, and she knows it." Naomi placed her hand on the armrest of the chair to stand up. The gesture was subtle, but enough to make Ethan take a half step back, even though he tried not to show it. She stood opposite him, not much taller, but possessed an aura that compelled others to adjust their posture. "Mr. Weller," she said clearly, emphasizing each word, "I've tolerated you twice already. This is the last time." Ethan blinked. "Excuse me." Naomi kept her voice calm. "I don't need to explain where I belong to anyone, and especially not to people who look down on others based on their appearance." Ethan blushed and said loudly, "What do you know about me, Naomi? I know you're crossing safety boundaries on the plane, and you're insulting other people." Ethan clenched his fist. "Oh, now you're the safety police." Naomi couldn't take her eyes off him, if necessary. Mila quickly interrupted, her voice urgent. "Please calm down. We're in the air. Causing a disturbance is a federal violation." Ethan Quay saying, "Mila, I was just defending myself against someone jamming the signal. She was carrying some kind of device." Naomi immediately replied, "I brought research equipment." Ethan retorted, "See, she admitted it." Naomi took a deep breath. She had kept her composure, almost as much as possible. Then she said something that completely stunned Ethan. "I designed the air signal system that this aircraft uses." Ethan frowned. "Air what?" Naomi replied clearly, without trembling. "An aviation risk control system. FAA approved, highly regarded by the military, and developed by Aerospace under my leadership." Ethan stood still. He couldn't believe it, but the calmness in Naomi's voice made it impossible for him to immediately refute her. Naomi continued, her voice soft like a gentle reminder, "If you say anything more offensive, I will ask the captain to take action." Ethan frowned, trying to regain his composure. "Are you threatening me, Naomi?" "No. I'm giving you one last chance to stop." A heavy silence fell. Ethan looked at Naomi, and there was a hint of bewilderment in his eyes. It was as if this was the first time he had met someone who refused to back down from his false sense of power. Then he turned abruptly, saying softly but sharply, "I'm not done with this." Naomi replied, "I know." He stepped forward, sat down in his old chair, and breathed heavily, as if someone had pushed him back a step in a nervous battle. Naomi returned to her seat. She didn't sigh. Her hands didn't tremble. "Just place your backpack next to you and look out the window." But inside her, one thing was clear: things had gone beyond the point of being not worth bothering about. Ethan was no longer a personal problem. He had become a threat to flight safety. And Naomi knew the moment she had to stand up and protect not only herself but also the crew and passengers was drawing near. The Gulfstream G700 glided through the thick clouds, leaving behind a vast ocean of white foam. Sunlight streamed through the small round windows, creating soft, interwoven patches of light and shadow in the cabin. It should have been a peaceful scene, if not for the growing storm in the sky. Naomi placed her backpack close to her feet. She sat in silence. But it wasn't the silence of resignation. It was the silence of someone calculating, not calculating revenge, but calculating how to keep everyone safe. From the front, Ethan's voice rang out again, this time low and urgent, as if someone were strangling his pride. "This is ridiculous. I'm being disrespected on my own flight, on a plane that wasn't his." Naomi listened silently, closing her eyes. Mila was standing near the galley, clearly uneasy. The other passengers tried to ignore it, but their eyes said it all they heard. They sensed the tension in the air. Some flights experienced slight turbulence due to wind. Some flights experienced slight turbulence due to people. And this flight is being shaken because of Ethan Weller. 3 minutes later, Naomi heard the seat in front of her being pulled sharply. Ethan jumped to his feet. This time, his steps weren't backward. He was heading towards the cockpit. Naomi opened her eyes. Her calmness instantly turned into alertness. She knew airline regulations all too well. Any passenger approaching the cabin without permission could become a hazard. And Ethan hadn't shown any sign of behaving reasonably so far. Mila reacted immediately, running to stand between Ethan and the cockpit door. "Mr. Weller, please return to your seat. This is a restricted area." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "I need to talk to the captain." "No, sir." Mila shook her head. "You must return to your seat." Ethan gave a wry smile. "I'm a priority passenger. I have the right. No one is allowed to enter the flight area unless requested to do so." Ethan clenched his fist. Clearly, he wasn't familiar with the word no. Naomi watched the scene from a distance. She felt her heart rate quicken slightly, not necessarily from fear, but from the intuition of someone who was all too familiar with aviation risks. If Ethan were to open the cockpit door, even just a crack, things would spiral out of control. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. No rush, no noise, just stand up and take a light step forward. But the moment Naomi stood up, the cabin seemed to shift its center of gravity. Ethan slammed his hand against the cockpit door, his voice louder. "I pay a fortune for these flights. The captain needs to hear about the service on this aircraft." And about Mila stopped him, her voice trembling but firm. "Mr. Weller, this is your final warning. If you don't return to your position, I will be forced to report to the captain." Ethan angrily spun around. "Go ahead. Report me. See what happens." Naomi had now walked to about the middle of the cabin. She wasn't too close, but close enough for Ethan to see her. He froze for a second. Just a second. But Naomi saw it very clearly. Because he thought she would stay away from this conflict. He didn't think she would stand up. He didn't think someone who didn't belong here would dare to step forward when he was in a rage. Naomi didn't see him as an enemy. She saw him as a child standing too close to the edge of a precipice. "Mr. Weller," she said, her voice low but clear, "you are endangering the safety of the flight." Ethan's eyes widened. "Safety? I just want to speak to the captain." Naomi shook her head. "No one is allowed to touch the cockpit door while the plane is in operation. That's federal law." "And what do you know about the law?" Ethan scoffed, but his voice wasn't as harsh as it had been at first. Naomi replied, her gaze direct and peaceful. "I work directly with the FAA on the flight safety project. I know more than you do." That statement cut the air in two. One passenger whispered, "Oh." Mila exhaled, as if someone had lifted her breath. As for Ethan, for the first time since the start of the flight, he looked unsteady. Not in his legs, but in his ego. He stammered, You're making this up." Naomi took another half step. Not threatening, not pressing closer. Just to let him know that she wasn't avoiding this conversation. "Mr. Weller," Naomi said, "you insulted the flight attendants. You disrupted the cabin signal. You kicked other people's property, and now you're trying to breach aviation security regulations." Ethan's face turned bright red. "I never touched the cockpit, I was just touched the door, and that's enough to be detained upon landing." He opened his mouth to argue, but Naomi added, "And the entire passenger cabin is witnessing it." The space suddenly became frozen. Ethan turned around, and for the first time, he noticed the three passengers in the middle of the cabin were looking at him. No one avoided his gaze. No one seemed embarrassed. They looked as if they already knew who was right and who was wrong. A middle-aged man whispered, "Sir, please sit down. You're scaring everyone." A woman nodded slightly. "We just want this flight to be safe." Those words were gentle yet enough to strip Ethan of what he held onto most control over the crowd. He turned to Naomi, his eyes a mixture of anger and confusion. You're making me lose face." Naomi shook her head very slowly. "I didn't do anything. You did it yourself." Ethan clenched his jaw, his chest heaving. Naomi thought about that fateful moment. Would he retreat or take another dangerous step? And then, Ethan abruptly pushed Mila aside, reaching up to touch the cockpit door handle again. A clanging sound rang out. Mila tripped over the edge of the carpet, nearly falling. A passenger let out a small cry. Ethan touched the door not to try and open it, but that touch crossed the final boundary. Just one touch, 1 second, one action. Naomi immediately stepped forward. Stop. Her voice rang out louder than ever before. Not a shout, but a command from the heart of someone who couldn't let things get out of control. Ethan turned his head. She knows. But Naomi stood between him and the door. Half of her body obscured the doorknob. Her voice was low, but the force in it made Ethan freeze. If you touch the door again, you won't just be detained upon landing. You'll be prosecuted. Mila stood behind Naomi, her voice trembling but firm. I will report this to the captain. Naomi couldn't take her eyes off Ethan. Mr. Weller, please sit down. Right. Now. At that moment, the cabin was silent. No more engine noise, no more wind, no more sounds whatsoever. Only the tense breathing of everyone remained. Ethan looked at Naomi, at those calm yet unforgiving eyes, and he realized for the first time that not everyone would bow down to his aggression. 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Then he turned away angrily, walking back to his seat. He didn't say another word. Don't kick the chair. Don't smirk. He simply sat down, tightening his seatbelt, as if it were the only thing he could control at that moment. Cabin breathed a sigh of relief. Mila was almost in tears. Naomi returned to her seat. She sat down. She leaned her head against the backrest. Her heart rate gradually returned to normal. But she knew one thing for sure. From the moment Ethan touched the cockpit door, it was no longer simply an act of rudeness. This has escalated into a serious matter, and the final outcome will no longer be in Ethan's hands. After Ethan Weller finally sat down, the Gulfstream G700 cabin fell into an eerie silence. None of the 6 passengers spoke. No one moved. No one dared open a laptop or turn on a phone. Everyone is listening, waiting, and trying to guess what will happen next. At an altitude of over 35000 feet, the engine hummed so steadily it sounded like a giant heartbeat. But even that heartbeat wasn't enough to mask the thick tension in the air. Naomi settled back into the rear seat, her arms slung over the straps of her backpack. She rested her head on the soft cushion, not to rest, but simply to keep herself from becoming overly tense. She felt her breathing quicken slightly, just a little, not because of fear, but because she understood the seriousness of what had just happened. Some aviation regulations are purely procedural, but there are also regulations where even a small deviation can lead to an accident. Touching the cockpit door while flying is the second type of violation. Naomi glanced at her hands. They were still steady, but in her mind, thoughts raced like the numbers on the control panel. What would Ethan do next? How would the crew react? Should they prepare for an emergency? Mila stepped closer, knelt down gently beside Naomi, and whispered in a voice barely audible, "Miss Carter, thank you. Without you, I don't know how far things would have gone." Naomi shook her head. "It's okay, Mila. You did the right thing. You kept the cabin safe." Mila bit her lip, her eyes slightly red. "But I didn't think he'd be that aggressive. I just wanted to tell him to sit down." Naomi placed her hand on Mila's wrist gently but firmly. "It's not your fault. Remember that." For the first time since the start of the flight, Naomi let her emotions soften. Not out of weakness, but to allow her heart to breathe after minutes of being as tense as a taut string. Mila stood up, tried to regain her professional smile, and returned to the kitchen. Naomi gently closed her eyes. The light filtering through her eyelids reminded her of a winter when she was a child, when her father taught her math at an old wooden desk. Her father used to say, "Not all problems can be solved by brute force. Some require you to stand a little further away to see the whole picture." Naomi understood that more than ever at this moment. Less than 2 minutes later, the internal speaker emitted a short beep. A deep, calm male voice rang out. "This is Captain Williams. We need to speak to the chief flight attendant in the cockpit." Mila immediately ran over. But before going inside, she glanced quickly at Naomi. A look full of worry. The cockpit door closed. No one could hear anything from the outside, but that silence made the cabin feel even heavier. Ethan crossed his legs, his hand trembling slightly on the armrest of the chair. He tried to appear calm, But Naomi saw it. His shoulders were tensed. He began to murmur to himself, "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything. This is blown out of proportion." Then, he looked around the cabin. No one defended him. No one spoke to him. No one dared to look him directly in the eye. The silence of the crowd when you're wrong carries the weight of a mountain. Ethan turned away, his jaw clenched. The cockpit door opened. Mila stepped out, her expression serious, but not panicked. She walked straight to Naomi. "Miss Carter," Mila said softly, "the captain wants to see you for a moment." Naomi nodded, stood up, adjusted her coat, and stepped forward. Her shoes touched the cabin carpet without a sound, but her appearance was enough to make a few people sitting in front of her look up. Ethan watched Naomi walk past, his gaze fixed on her every step, no longer contemptuous, but now wary. Naomi paused at the cockpit door. Captain Williams, a middle-aged man with a calm, steady voice, looked at her for a few seconds, as if assessing her composure. "Miss Carter," he said, "Mila has reported the whole thing. I'd like to hear more from you, if you deem it necessary." Naomi nodded. He approached the cockpit door twice. The second time, he touched the doorknob. And before that, he had threatened the flight attendant. The captain sighed, his eyes fixed on the back of the cabin. "We monitored everything through overhead cameras." Naomi was slightly startled. She had forgotten that the G700 cabin had a wide-angle camera for security purposes. "She handled it perfectly," the captain continued. "If he had tried again, we would have been forced to turn around or make an emergency landing. But that would have caused a major disruption for everyone." Naomi replied softly, "I understand. I just want to protect the safety of the crew." The captain nodded deeply. His eyes filled with respect. "Thank you. You've kept the situation more stable than we expected." Naomi was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Captain, I can't predict what he'll do next. But my intuition tells me this isn't over yet." Williams closed the small control panel on the door. "We'll be watching closely. But just so you know, if he crosses the line again, I'll notify the FAA immediately and arrange for a landing at the nearest airport." Naomi nodded again and returned to her seat. One thing became even clearer in her mind. If Ethan crosses the line again, there will be no chance for a warning next time. As Naomi walked past, Ethan looked up. "The captain called you." Naomi didn't stop there. "That's right," Ethan said sharply. "And what did you tell him?" Naomi responded with just one sentence: "Truth." Ethan frowned and clenched his fists, but Naomi had already walked past. She didn't need to look to know he was losing control more and more. She sat down in her seat and fastened her seatbelt. The sky began to shake slightly. The plane was passing through a low-pressure area. Naomi placed her hand on her backpack, a habitual way to calm herself. But her hand was cold, not because she was afraid of Ethan, but because she sensed this was only the beginning of a much bigger problem. People like Ethan don't just give up because they're pointed out, they often retaliate. Naomi looked up at the band of clouds outside. The sky darkened for a moment. Then, it brightened again. A journey is like a person, sometimes calm, sometimes stormy. Mila walked past gently, touching Naomi's shoulder as if whispering, "I'm here." Naomi nodded slightly. In that calmness, her inner strength had grown even stronger. The flight continued on, silent, but Naomi knew. A storm isn't defined by howling winds. A storm begins when the wind stops blowing. And in that false sense of peace, Ethan began a new plan. A plan that could put the entire flight at risk. A plan. Naomi hadn't seen it yet, but she sensed it very clearly. The Gulfstream G700's cabin continued to drift into a profound silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that relaxes passengers. It felt more like stepping into a room where someone had just argued. The air was still hot, lingering with the unspoken words. Naomi leaned back in her chair, watching the dim light reflect off the walnut-wood surface of the folding table in front of her. From that perspective, everything seemed to be in a static painting waiting for a touch to shatter it. She opened her laptop to review the plan for the Denver outing, but the words in front of her were unsettling. They blurred whenever the image of Ethan pressed against the cockpit door flashed through her mind. There are moments, even though you've moved on, that your mind relives at least 10 times. She took a deep breath and pressed her fingers lightly against her temples. Her father, James, once said, "You can be strong, but being strong doesn't mean you don't get tired." Naomi knew that was true for her right now. In the seat across from him, Ethan Weller sat up straight. His face was no longer red with anger, but had turned a pale, almost bluish hue. The kind of paleness of someone about to do something they shouldn't but feel they have the right to. He opened his leather bag, took out his phone, and tried to reconnect to Wi-Fi. Impossible. He gave a faint smile. Figures. They shut it off because of her. The man sitting in the two front seats glanced in his direction. A middle-aged woman also subtly withdrew her hand to her lap, as if avoiding being drawn into the vortex. Ethan leaned back and muttered, "She thinks she won. She thinks she can embarrass me up here." Then he pressed the record button on his phone. No one heard. Only a small red light flashed. He spoke very softly, but his voice was cold and sharp. "I'll show them. I'll show her. They'll know what she did." The most terrifying thing about people like Ethan isn't their anger, but their stubborn insistence on proving they are the victims. Mila appeared in the hallway, carrying a large water bottle and a few paper cups. She tried to keep her voice steady, but Naomi noticed Mila's hands were trembling slightly. "Is this area all right?" Mila whispered to Naomi. Naomi nodded. "It's all right. Take a break. You've been stressed out for a while now." Mila pursed her lips. "I'm just worried. He could go berserk at any moment." Naomi sighed. "You're not wrong, but you're not responsible alone. We have the cockpit. We have the cameras. We have the captain. No one will leave you to face this alone anymore." Mila smiled softly, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you, Miss Carter." Naomi smiled too. "Just call me Naomi." Those who have fought for respect often have a keen intuition about the fears of others. Naomi didn't need to know much about Mila. She only needed to see that look in her eyes to understand. The cabin became quiet again, but it only stayed quiet for a few minutes. Then, Naomi heard a clicking sound, very quiet, but different from the normal sounds of the airplane cabin. She opened her eyes and looked around. The sound came from behind near where Ethan was sitting. Naomi peeked through her eyelids. Ethan was bent over, his eyes glued to his phone. But what was noticeable was that he was whispering. He's clearly leaving a voicemail message. Naomi tilted her head, unable to hear what was being said, but she saw his eyes, something very dark hidden beneath. A premonition once again gripped her heart. Shortly after, Mila walked over to Ethan's seat. "Mr. Weller, would you like more water?" Ethan didn't look up. "I don't need anything from you." Mila tried to keep her voice soft. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Ethan burst out laughing. "Okay." After being insulted and humiliated in front of everyone, his voice rose. A few passengers jumped. Mila took a small step back. "I didn't mean," Ethan interrupted. "Please be quiet for my sake." His voice wasn't loud, but it was cold. Very cold. Mila turned away. Naomi only saw her back shrink, but become more resolute than it had been a few minutes earlier. Naomi closed her laptop, unbuckled her seatbelt, and stood up. She walked closer to Ethan, but not so close that he would think she wanted to confront him. "Mr. Weller," Naomi said, her voice calm and clear. "I suggest you maintain appropriate conduct towards the flight attendants." Ethan looked up, his eyes filled with rage. "You are not allowed to give me orders." Naomi looked him straight in the eye. "This isn't an order. This is a safety regulation. Passengers are not allowed to threaten the crew. If you continue, the captain has the right to request FAA intervention." Ethan gave a wry smile. "She talks as if she's the decision-maker on this plane." Naomi leaned lightly on the back of the seat in front of her, her voice lowering. "I don't want to make a big deal out of this, but I will do what is necessary if safety is threatened. You should understand all the passengers are witnessing this." A woman in the back seat nodded and whispered, "She's right." A man on the left added, "We've seen him cross the line before." Ethan looked around the cabin. Everyone avoided him after they saw him. It was the kind of silence that hurt his ego more than any scolding. Naomi returned to her seat, but as soon as she sat down, her heart tightened slightly. Something just flashed through her mind. A very small question, but as sharp as a knife. If Ethan recorded it, what did he intend to use it for? For someone who has always lived by power like him, losing on an airplane is unacceptable. And people like that usually don't attack directly. They attack by creating a news story. Naomi opened her phone. No Wi-Fi. No cell phone signal. She couldn't check anything. She couldn't know how many false accusations Ethan had planned to spread. That feeling reminded her of her first public debate at the TED conference about the impact of discrimination in technology. That day, she was heavily criticized by the conservative media. They took her words out of context, portraying her as a hot-headed, provocative person. She learned to be strong in silence. But too much silence can also give others an excuse to rewrite your story. Naomi clasped her hands together, lost in thought. Should she act now, or should she wait until landing? Would further restraint only escalate the situation? These problems were more difficult than any logistics problem she had ever solved. Mila turned around and whispered in Naomi's ear. The captain wants me to check if Ethan is trying to record anything. Should I go closer? Naomi looked towards Ethan. He was twirling his phone in his hand, his eyes glancing at everyone, his expression full of calculated intent. Naomi lowered her voice. No, don't get close. Just let him think no one's paying attention. But remember to watch from a distance. Mila nodded quickly. Naomi continued, if any passenger appears unwell, report it to the captain immediately. Yes, Naomi. The plane began to shake more violently. The mild turbulence lasted for nearly 20 seconds. A ding sound was heard. The seatbelt symbol lit up. The captain announced, we are entering an area with unstable weather conditions. Passengers are asked to keep their seatbelts fastened and minimize movement. Naomi sighed. In her mind, a very clear premonition. If Ethan wanted to act recklessly, this was the time he would choose. The cabin shook slightly. The passengers sat still. No one stood up to intervene if he caused trouble. Naomi just hoped her intuition was wrong. But then she saw Ethan lean even deeper, the phone pressed against his thigh, his mouth whispering continuously. A passenger in the middle row whispered, I think he's sending messages out. Another person replied, but there's no internet. Naomi heard that. She suddenly understood. Ethan doesn't need Wi-Fi. He just needs to record audio, video, or pretend to be threatened. Once the plane lands, he can spread the story in the direction he wants. Naomi closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened her eyes, they were as sharp as a freshly sharpened blade. She knew what she had to do. She unbuckled her seatbelt. Stand it up. Walked straight to Ethan's seat. Everyone in the cabin held their breath. Naomi stopped in front of him. Mr. Weller, she said slowly, each word clear. I need you to put the phone down. Ethan looked up very slowly. His eyes were red, and he wore a cold smile. Who do you think you are to make such a demand of me? Naomi replied. I am the passenger you threatened, and I believe you are trying to fabricate evidence. Ethan tightened his grip on the phone. Naomi continued. If you continue to act erratically, I will instruct the captain to make an emergency landing and notify the TSA. The entire cabin was completely silent. All that remained was the vibration of the aircraft in the turbulent air. Ethan leaned back. A smirk played on his lips. You think you've won. Naomi Carter, you have no idea what I'm doing. Naomi tightened her grip on the backpack strap. Her voice dropped dangerously low. No, but I know you won't get another chance. At that very moment, a small clicking sound was heard. Ethan's phone lit up, displaying the following message, voice memo saved. Naomi understood immediately. He recorded the entire conversation, and he will try to use it to fabricate a false story. She looked straight at him. They both stood in a silence, as tense as a drumhead. Naomi whispered, You've just crossed the final line. The seemingly calm situation has begun to take a more dangerous turn. Naomi understood. She couldn't wait. She couldn't remain silent any longer. She had to act, and she had to act immediately. The moment Ethan pressed save on the recording, the airplane cabin seemed to shrink. The space felt more cramped than usual. The lights dimmer than usual, and everyone's breathing was quieter than usual. Naomi Carter stood opposite him. In her eyes, there was no weariness, no forbearance. Only the cold, clear insight of someone who knew a limit had been crossed. An elderly passenger sitting near the window whispered to his wife, This isn't going to end peacefully. Naomi couldn't take her eyes off Ethan. Mr. Weller, she said softly, her voice barely audible, yet sharp as a blade, you just recorded this conversation without permission. And you're trying to use it for ulterior motives. Ethan smirked, not innocent by your definition, Naomi Carter. Naomi didn't answer. She watched how he held the phone, a kind of anxious grip, a reluctance to let go. Those who are faint-hearted often grab onto things they think will save them. Naomi understands this type of person well because she's dealt with people like that throughout her career. She turned to Mila, who was standing a few steps behind her, her face tense. "Mila," Naomi said, "please ask Captain Williams to come to the cabin." Mila was startled. "Now?" During this time of turmoil, Naomi nodded slightly. She knows this isn't the ideal time, but if we delay any longer, we'll lose control. Mila took a deep breath. "Yes. Let me inform them." She hurried toward the cockpit, while Naomi took a step back to her seat, her eyes never leaving Ethan. The disturbance lasted for about 10 more seconds before subsiding. A click echoed from the cockpit door. Captain Williams emerged, his posture steady despite the slight turbulence in the aircraft. He looked around and realized the atmosphere was as tense as a taut string pulled to its limit. Naomi stood up as he approached. "Captain," she whispered, "I need to report this now before things get worse." Williams nodded, his eyes serious. "Please speak." Naomi pointed toward Ethan. The passenger was deliberately recording, fabricating conversations, and threatening the crew. "I believe he was preparing to release false information upon landing. And I believe the cabin was at risk for safety." A few passengers nodded slightly in confirmation. One man said, "I saw him whispering on the phone for 5 or 10 minutes. Another woman added, "He kept putting pressure on the flight attendants. I'm afraid he'll do something else." Ethan jumped up from his chair. "You're all talking nonsense. I was just defending myself from her threats." He pointed directly at Naomi. The captain lowered his voice, but his tone was sharp and decisive. "Mr. Weller, please sit down." Ethan clenched his fist. "No, Mr. Weller," Williams said again, more forcefully, not raising his voice, but with the authority of someone who had once piloted a fighter jet. Ethan froze. He sat down, breathing heavily through his nose. Naomi noticed a slight tremor in his hand. Not a tremor of fear, rather a tremor, as he calculated his next move. The captain turned back to Naomi. "Miss Carter, how would you assess the level of threat he poses?" Naomi straightened her back. "Mr. Williams, I believe he will continue to cause trouble. And if we land without prior control, he will immediately release false information, putting the crew and passengers at legal risk." Williams looked deep into her eyes. There was no panic. There was no arrogance. Only calmness, sharpness, and responsibility. He nodded. "I get it." He pressed the button on the small walkie-talkie attached to his shirt. "First officer, I'm leaving the cabin for 3 more minutes. Maintain altitude," the co-pilot's voice replied. "Roger that." Then, Williams said to Naomi, "I'd like to hear your proposal. Clearly you've thought this through." The entire cabin turned its gaze towards Naomi. Some passengers fell silent, as if witnessing a hearing in the sky. Naomi took a very deep breath. She knew that one wrong decision could turn this flight into an emergency. But she had no choice. "Captain," Naomi said clearly, "I propose placing Ethan Weller on high-risk passenger monitoring. Cut off all services, ban electronic devices, and have the TSA ready when we land." One passenger let out a sigh of relief, not in protest, but rather relief. Williams looked at Naomi for a few more seconds, then turned to Ethan. "Mr. Weller," he said, "I have received reports that you have been threatening staff and potentially interfering with flight operations. This aircraft is under my command, and I will be implementing safety procedures." Ethan jumped up. "He has no right." Williams straightened his back. "I have full authority." Ethan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was silenced by the cold eyes of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions. The captain continued. "Crew, activate the high-risk passenger monitoring mode. All other passengers, please remain calm. There is no current danger." A soft ding sounded in the cabin, a signal that the flight crew had activated an internal procedure. Mila walked to the middle of the cabin, her face relaxed but serious. Naomi felt, her chest finally felt a little easier to breathe. But she knew this wasn't the end. For people like Ethan, being controlled wasn't what stopped them. It only prepared them better for retaliation. Williams turned back to Naomi. "Thank you, Miss Carter. You remained calm during that tense moment in the cabin. Not everyone can do that." Naomi nodded. "I want everyone to be safe. I don't want anyone to get hurt because of his lack of self-control." The captain placed his hand on the armrest of the seat and bowed slightly, a more formal expression of gratitude. Then he went back into the cockpit. The door slammed shut, a metallic sound echoing like a final command. Ethan sat frozen, his eyes red with anger, but he didn't dare stand up again. No one looked at him with sympathy anymore. No one believed he was a victim anymore. No one wanted to hear his explanation anymore. That feeling of being stripped of power was what angered him the most. Naomi knew that, and she knew Ethan's sinister silence was more dangerous than his screams. Mila walked over to Naomi's chair and whispered, "Naomi, I've never seen anyone stand so steady in the face of someone who's lost control." Naomi smiled slightly. "When I faced discrimination my whole life, I learned two things: stand tall and breathe deeply." They both smiled very softly, a smile of revival, a smile of people who had survived a moment of danger. The cabin returned to its natural rhythm. Passengers drank water. An elderly couple held hands. A young man reopened his book. Naomi sat down, running her hand along the strap of her backpack. Although no one could see, she trembled slightly for a few seconds. She wasn't afraid of Ethan. She was afraid of what all strong people are afraid of: responsibility. It's a responsibility to do the right thing, even when you're tired, even when your heart no longer wants to fight. She leaned her head back against the chair and closed her eyes. It was a moment of silence, a real silence, because she knew the bigger storm was coming from underground, not from the sky. And once he lands, Ethan Weller won't be sitting still. Never. The Gulfstream G700's cabin slowly returned to normal. But like a house that had just escaped a small fire, though the flames were gone, the smell of burning and the heat still lingered in the air. The tense stares from the passengers gradually dissipated, but no one was truly relaxed. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her hands resting on her lap. She maintained the composure of someone who had just made an important decision. But inside, her heart hadn't completely calmed down. She knew that when a wolf is cornered, it doesn't lie down. It waits for an opportunity to strike back. Naomi understood that Ethan was exactly that kind of person. Mila stood at the front of the compartment checking each passenger's seatbelt, her eyes showing clear vigilance. Each time she walked past Ethan, her shoulders tensed slightly as if instinctively protecting herself. Ethan was sitting unusually still. Too still. He clasped his hands together on his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor, neither speaking nor moving. But Naomi had encountered too many people who concealed their anger with silence. This kind of silence isn't for reconciliation. It's for planning. Naomi glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, trying to maintain a calm expression, but a faint sense of unease had just begun to surface in her heart. Outside the window, the sky offered a rare patch of blue amidst the thick clouds. Sunlight shone on the plane's wing, causing the gleaming metal to reflect off the cabin. Naomi gazed out for a few seconds, taking in the fresh air of this fleeting moment of peace. She closed her eyes. Just a little bit. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw again the image of her father, the man with the deep, warm voice who had taught her how to stand firm amidst insults. You can't expect everyone to be kind to you, but you can always choose to be kind to yourself. Naomi pursed her lips. That's why she wasn't going to duel Ethan. She didn't need to win by shouting. She would win with dignity. But people like Ethan often view kindness as a weakness. A small beep sounded from the control panel on the ceiling. Not a loud alarm, just an announcement that the intercom system had a new message. Immediately, Mila received a signal from the cockpit via the small radio on her lapel. "Yes, I'm listening," Mila said. A silence. "Understood, Captain." Mila folded the walkie-talkie shut and took a deep breath. She walked quickly to Naomi's seat. "Naomi," her voice was low but clear, "Captain Williams wants you to prepare yourself." Naomi opened her eyes. "What is up?" Mila glanced around the cabin before speaking. "We just received information from the ground. Someone uploaded an audio recording of a male voice online less than 5 minutes ago." Naomi straightened her back. A passenger in front quietly asked, "What's up?" Mila shook her head, not answering them, and spoke only to Naomi. "The audio recording accuses a female passenger on the flight of threatening someone else. The content has been edited. The captain suspects it was Ethan." Naomi closed her eyes for 3 seconds. It wasn't because she was shocked. It was because she knew this would happen. "It's just, Ethan acted faster than expected." "Has the recording gone viral yet?" Naomi asked. "It hasn't gone viral yet, but a few accounts have already shared it. I guess no one has verified the source," Mila replied. Naomi opened her eyes, her gaze sharp again. Mila, do you know what this means? Mila nodded. If it gets out of control, the press might be waiting when the plane lands. And if the story gets misinterpreted, everyone on the plane, including the crew, could be dragged into serious trouble. Naomi sighed very softly. Ethan doesn't attack with actions. He attacks with stories. And sometimes, a story can be more dangerous than a fist. Mila continued. The captain asked if she wanted to divert the plane to a secondary airport to handle the issue discreetly or contact the TSA before landing. Naomi remained silent. Such a decision could affect the schedules of dozens of people. It could cause delays, additional costs, and even anxiety for passengers. She recalled her experiences at conferences in humanitarian conflict zones and in places where a wrong decision could affect hundreds of people. Naomi has learned to balance everything: emotions, reason, safety, and consequences. She asked Mila, if we change course, how long will it take? Approximately 45 minutes for a return trip and at least 2 hours for security handling on the ground. Naomi nodded deep in thought. Mila, what if it lands normally? Mila replied, the TSA will be waiting right at the door, but the media could also show up if the recording goes viral. Naomi looked down at her hands. She gently twirled the delicate silver bracelet on her ring finger, a gift from her mother on the day she became CEO. Not for aesthetic reasons, but to remind her, strength isn't about shouting. Strength is about choosing the right thing to do, even if it's difficult. She looked up, her voice firm. Mila, I'm not going to let him define my story. No diversions. Just land at the original airport. Mila was slightly startled. Naomi, are you sure? Certainly, Naomi replied. The more we hide, the more likely his story is to spread. I want to confront him directly. Mila looked at her, and in her eyes, there was genuine respect and admiration. I'll report this to the captain. Naomi sat back down in her seat and fastened her seatbelt. However, her mind began to fill with questions. Is Ethan hiding anything else? Is he recording anything else? Is he in contact with anyone underground? Each question felt like a cold wind sweeping across my chest. She placed a hand on the strap of her backpack, the backpack that had accompanied her through countless airports, events, and meetings. It had always been there for her when she succeeded, and even when she was attacked because of her skin color, her gender, and her voice. No one can understand the feeling of carrying the burden of a black leader in a world where power is often associated with the face of a white man. But Naomi understood, and that's why she won't back down. A ding sound came from the cockpit. Captain Williams announced, ladies and gentlemen, we are on course and are about to enter a 25-minute descent. Please keep your seatbelts fastened. His voice was calm, but Naomi could hear the caution beneath it. The warning wasn't in the words themselves. It was in the way he paused, the way he prolonged the final syllables, as if he were monitoring something unusual. Naomi glanced at Ethan. He was staring straight out the window, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breathing was slightly more rapid. His back was as tense as a bowstring. Ethan knew he had failed to keep the story entirely in his control. But he didn't give up. People like him never give up when their power is threatened. Naomi felt it distinctly, like an electric current running down her spine. Suddenly, Ethan jumped to his feet. Everyone in the cabin held their breath. Mila has quick reflexes. Mr. Weller, please sit down. We are preparing to descend. Ethan turned around, his voice as cold as metal. I want to speak to the captain. Naomi secretly tightened her grip on her backpack straps. Mila remained calm. I'm very sorry, but according to regulations, you are not allowed in the cockpit area at this time. Ethan gave a wry smile. Rules? Do you think I care about rules? Then he looked at Naomi. His gaze was like a knife. Do you think you've won? I'll make sure everyone knows what you did. Naomi stood up and took a small step forward, and sure enough to assert her position, but not enough to provoke. Mr. Weller, she said, slowly, you've missed your chance to speak up first. Now all you can do is wait for the TSA to do its job. Ethan gritted his teeth. He is very close to the danger zone. Mila raised her hand in a warning gesture. Mr. Weller, please sit down immediately, or I will be forced to activate the restriction procedure. He looked at the two women before him. One young, small but resilient, the other strong with an inexplicable calmness. Then he let out a dry, guttural laugh. This is just the beginning. He sat down again, but his eyes blazed with fire. Naomi felt he had prepared his next move. And the most dangerous part is yet to come. The soft yellow light of the cabin reflected on Naomi Carter's face. A strange serenity enveloped her, but not the serenity of complacency. Rather, it was the serenity of someone who had accepted the truth. A greater confrontation awaited her underground. The Gulf Stream G700 began its descent. The fuselage tilted slightly, causing some passengers to grip the armrests. The engines changed rhythm, becoming deeper and longer, signaling that the landing preparation phase had officially begun. Mila walked quietly down the aisle, double-checking each passenger's seatbelt, but no one seemed bothered. They cooperated silently, as if the entire cabin had become a temporary community, a community bound together by a shared sense of unease. Naomi watched Mila, her eyes warming slightly. She understood the immense pressure the young woman was under. She remembers being Mila's age, facing skeptical stares in her first boardroom meeting. No one believed a young black woman could lead. She had to learn to stand tall, even when the whole room wanted her to sit down. Ethan Weller, on the other hand, was not at ease. He sat in the left-hand seat, his hand still clutching his phone like a lifeline. His legs trembled slightly, but he tried to maintain a cold expression, the kind of coldness of someone calculating which cards they had left in their hand. Naomi looked at him for a second. Just a second, but that was enough to see the fire of discontent in his eyes. He wouldn't stop upon landing. She felt it as clearly as the sound of the engine outside the window. Mila turned around and sat in the back, but before she could fasten her seatbelt, the intercom attached to her jacket emitted a sound. "Mila, this is the captain. Let me see Naomi Carter when she's ready." Mila nodded slightly, then walked over to Naomi. "Naomi, the captain wants to talk," he said. "Something new has happened." Naomi placed her hand on her chest and took a deep breath. Not out of fear, but because she knew that any information at this moment could turn the tide. She stood up. Her steps were slow but steady, as if she were walking into a familiar crisis management room. Captain Williams slightly opened the cockpit door as Naomi approached. "Miss Carter," he said softly, "I need you to listen to this." She stepped inside a few inches, not all the way into the cockpit to comply with safety regulations, but enough to see his serious expression. Williams handed her the tablet screen. Above is the interface of a social media forum, where the audio recording that Ethan released has started reappearing. An anonymous account posted the following message. On a private flight, a female passenger was threatening another passenger. This is proof. Listen and share. The recording was edited, only containing Naomi's voice, saying, "You have no right to continue doing this," and a mix of sounds and someone else's panicked voice clearly added in. Williams said, "I've just received a report from the ground. Airport security is asking us to prepare for TSA intervention as soon as we land." Naomi was silent for a few seconds. The captain continued, "Miss Carter, I believe you. All the crew members believe you. But on the ground, the procedure isn't based on emotion. It's based on evidence. And this evidence, however manipulated, could put the plane into a legal emergency." Naomi whispered, "What do you want me to do?" Williams looked at Naomi with great respect. "You need to prepare yourself. Upon landing, you may be asked to stay for temporary questioning." Naomi wasn't startled. She didn't tremble. She just nodded slightly. "I get it." But her eyes drooped slightly, not because she was afraid for herself, but because she knew this would be a burden for Mila, for the crew, and for the innocent passengers. The captain added, "Miss Carter, I've never seen anyone remain so calm. I hope the truth will come to light as quickly as possible." Naomi smiled faintly, but it was a weary smile. The truth always finds a way to speak for itself. Sometimes, it's just a little slow. Williams bowed slightly, then closed the cockpit door. Naomi returned to her seat. Mila walked over. "Are you okay?" Mila asked. Naomi nodded. "I'm fine." But in truth, something inside her was shrinking. She wasn't afraid of being misunderstood. She had been misunderstood many times in her life. The only thing that hurt her was that Ethan had dragged the entire flight into a toxic mess. She looked around. The cabin strangers who wanted to peacefully get to where they needed to be were now witnessing a war no one had chosen. Naomi took a deep breath, then leaned her head back against the chair. She tried to find peace in the sound of the wind outside the window. But that peace was shattered the moment Ethan let out a soft chuckle. No one looked at him. But everyone heard him, a smile full of victory. Naomi didn't turn her head. She simply closed her eyes and felt his presence clearly, like a dark streak in a brightly lit cabin. Ethan spoke loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Do you think you're in control of everything? Just wait until we land. The world will know who you are." Naomi opened her eyes. Not angry, not trembling. Just calmly looking straight at him. "I know who I am, Ethan. And the world will know who you are." Ethan paused for a moment. Naomi continued, her voice like a gentle yet deep stream. "You've forgotten one thing. The truth can be distorted, but it never disappears." Ethan smirked. "You're betting on the truth. Good luck." Naomi tilted her head. "I'm not betting, Ethan. I'm just waiting for the right moment for it to appear." He raised his eyebrows, but the smile faded. There was something in Naomi's voice that made him uneasy. The cabin gradually darkened as the plane descended into the thick clouds. The light was bent off the glass surfaces, creating long gray streaks like the shadows of time stretching out. One passenger bowed their head in prayer. Another held their partner's hand tightly. The captain's voice rang out. "We are preparing for the landing phase. Please all remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." Mila checked everything one last time. Ethan stared out the window, his shoulders tense. Naomi placed her hand on her backpack. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness of my eyelids, something suddenly appeared. She wasn't fighting Ethan. She was fighting a system that believed in the loudest voice. She has fought against it her whole life. And today, she will fight it again. It wasn't about winning. It was about living true to what she believed in. The plane was shaking violently. A slight jolt, then a soft thud beneath the aircraft's fuselage. The Gulfstream G-700 touched down on the runway. Some passengers breathed a sigh of relief. Ethan leaned into the aisle, as if preparing to stand up before the plane came to a complete stop. Mila immediately reminded him. "Sit down, Mr. Weller." Ethan didn't listen. He looked out the window, where a flashing green light indicated that the security vehicle was waiting. He smiled. A smile of someone who thinks they've won the final game of chess. Naomi saw that smile, but she just gave a different smile. A very small smile, and very peaceful, because she knew something that Ethan didn't know. One thing would leave him speechless. When the airplane door opened, the Gulfstream G-700 descended the runway like an iron bird struggling to maintain balance in a strong wind. Airport lights swept long streaks of light through the small windows, reflecting on the faces of all the passengers, people who had just experienced a flight they would remember for a long time. Naomi Carter opened her eyes as the plane's wheels touched down. No one heard her faint sigh, but it held a profound weariness and unwavering determination. Mila looked at Naomi from the front of the compartment, her eyes seemingly asking, "Are you ready?" Naomi nodded slightly. No one is truly prepared for the moment of facing false accusations, but she was always ready to face the truth. Ethan Weller, on the other hand, almost jumped out of his seat while the plane was still taxiing. Mila immediately whispered, "Mr. Weller, please sit down immediately." Ethan looked at her with a challenging gaze. "I have the right to leave the plane when it stops. And they're waiting for me out there." He looked out the window. On the driveway, leading to the parking lot, the green and orange lights of the airport security team were flashing continuously. A black SUV, the TSA, was parked right next to the stop. Ethan wore a smug smile. "Miss Carter, you're finished." Naomi didn't answer. She just looked down at her hands, which rested parallel on her lap, strangely calm. Ethan raised an eyebrow. She didn't say anything. Naomi looked up, her expression as gentle as the wind. "Ethan, as I said before, the truth doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment." He burst out laughing. "The truth? Oh, you'd be surprised." The plane came to a complete stop. The sound of seatbelts snapping opened simultaneously. Mila opened the main cabin door, and a blast of cold air from the runway rushed in. Immediately, 3 TSA officers stepped up the stairs, standing in a commanding line. The person leading the way was a sturdy, dark-skinned woman. She introduced herself. "This is Agent Renee Collins, Transportation Security Administration. We have received a report of an incident involving interference with flight safety and passenger threats." Ethan immediately stepped forward, pushing his way to the front, his voice so loud that it startled several passengers. Yes, it's her, Naomi Carter. I'm the one being threatened. I have the audio evidence here. He held out his phone, his hands trembling with excitement. Agent Collins gestured with his hand. Sir, please stand a step away from me and remain calm. I'm perfectly calm. Ethan yelled. I just want her arrested. Naomi remained still. The wind blowing from the door touched her face, cold but strangely pleasant. Collins glanced at Naomi. Ma'am, please step forward a little. We need to hear from you. Everyone in the cabin held their breath. Naomi stepped forward gently, without trembling. She looked at Collins, neither pleading nor defensive, only respect. Agent Collins, Naomi said, did you receive any audio recordings from the anonymous account? Collins nodded. Yes, but we need further verification. Naomi looked her straight in the eyes. Good. Because I thought you needed to see this. She turned to Mila. Mila, bring out the cockpit camera footage for this flight and show it to them. Mila nodded emphatically. Yes, right away. Ethan was stunned. What? No, no need. My recording is enough. Mila opened the overhead compartment and retrieved the mini black box containing cabin video. On a G700 flight, the entire cabin from beginning to end is recorded according to security standards. 2 TSA employees turn on the screen for a quick check. The video is clear. Ethan approaches the cockpit. Ethan shouts. Ethan blocks Mila's path. Ethan curses at Naomi. Ethan kicks Naomi's backpack. Ethan yells, Who do you think you are? Mila asks him to sit down 4 times. Naomi remains calm the entire time. There was no sign that Naomi was threatening him. Agent Collins looked at Ethan. Her face was as cold as steel. Mr. Weller, do you have any explanation for this? Ethan stammered. I. That video was edited. The angle is wrong. It's not right. One passenger stood up. No editing whatsoever. We all witnessed it. Another person continued. I am willing to testify. A middle-aged woman added. He threatened the flight attendant. That's the truth. Ethan started to tremble. Instead of feeling confident, he became panicked. No, she did that to harm me. The video is staged. All of you. Collins raised his hand. Mr. Weller, I request that you stop. Ethan shouted. I won't stop, Mayor. Ethan Weller. Collins shouted, his voice strong and commanding, typical of someone with military training. The entire cabin was completely silent. Collins took a step forward. You are in violation of Article 49 CFR Section 1540, interference with the crew, creating a dangerous situation and making a false statement to security. You are being detained immediately. Ethan turned pale. No, I don't. 2 TSA officers grabbed his arms, turned him around, and handcuffed him on the spot. He struggled. You're wrong, she's the criminal. But the cabin remained silent. The silence was as heavy as a verdict. Naomi stepped back, making way for them to lead Ethan outside. As he passed her, he shouted one last time, You will regret it, you. But his voice was swallowed up by the wind on the runway. The airplane door closed, and the cabin breathed a sigh of relief. Mila went to Naomi first. She said nothing, just gently took Naomi's arm, a small gesture, but one filled with gratitude. A passenger stood up. Miss Carter, thank you for keeping us safe. Another person chimed in. You're incredibly calm. If I were in your position, I'd probably panic. Naomi smiled, a warm smile, but with a hint of sadness. I'm not stronger than anyone else. I'm just used to dealing with people who doubt my worth. Mila looked at Naomi for a long time. Naomi said to everyone in the cabin, Thank you, everyone. Without your calmness and presence, things could have been different. A young man said, Miss Carter, I think you are an inspiration, not because you fought back against him, but because you stayed true to yourself. Naomi bowed her head slightly. Sometimes victory isn't about taking someone down, but about preventing them from dragging you down. As Nadia and Mila disembarked from the plane airport, security stood on either side to ensure privacy. They bowed to Naomi as a silent sign of respect. Mila whispered, Naomi, if it were me today, I would have burst into tears. Naomi smiled gently. It's okay to cry. Emotions don't make anyone weak. They just make us more human. Mila looked down at her shoes, then said, Do you think Ethan will cause any more trouble? Naomi gazed into the distance, at the changing colors of the evening sky. Maybe, but this is no longer my fight. I've said what needed to be said, done what needed to be done. She paused, then smiled a gentle yet strangely beautiful smile. The rest? Let the truth do its job. And then as Naomi stepped into the waiting black SUV, outside the cold wind touched her face, bringing with it the feeling of a chapter having just closed. She looked back at the G700 behind her peaceful, standing still like a silent witness. Naomi whispered, "No one has the right to take away my dignity, unless I give it away." She didn't give it to him, and so she kept them all. If you're still here, still listening to the end of the story, I really thank you. Stories like Naomi Carter's journey are not meant to be heard and forgotten. They remind us of courage, truth, and the dignity that each person deserves to uphold. If this story resonates with you, even just a little, if it makes you think about kindness, strength, or the times you had to stand up for yourself, so please like and share to spread the positive message and subscribe to the Positive Message channel to join us in our next heartwarming stories. Thank you for your time. See you on the next trip.